A couple slides. I will just name this as a mindful moment practice that we have during PDs, where we'll have time where I invite staff to check in with themselves and see what they need in that moment. Do they need to move? Do they need to stretch? Would they rather write a letter of gratitude or list gratitude? Would they like to just focus on their breathing? Or would they like to doodle, just draw circles, draw shapes? And we talk about like the science and everything behind that. And I'll upload everything onto the S'more, but there's some research articles and stuff that I share that are on the S'more as well. Just to offer choice in paying attention to what we need in each individual moment. So the next two sections, equity commitment and trauma awareness, I'm going to focus mostly on the equity commitment piece. I see equity and trauma as very intertwined because racial trauma is incredibly real, and it's something that is not paid attention to enough, in my opinion, when we talk about trauma. We talk about trauma a lot of times, it's like childhood stuff, and but it's very rarely do we talk and mention racial trauma. So we're going to focus more on the equity commitment. Would somebody like to read our definition of equity commitment? This is from the National Equity Project. Anybody want to read? Thank you, Mom.
Educational equity means that each child receives what they need to develop to their full academic and social potential.
Would anybody like to read the words and the arrow, the image also from the National Equity Project?
To achieve equity in education, we must develop leaders who can transform our institutions by eliminating inequitable practices and cultivate the unique gifts, talents, and interests of every child, so that success and failure are no longer predictable by student identity, racial, cultural, economic, or any other social factor.
Thank you. So I put a link to the National Equity Project on this more for y'all, and I see this, like the way that I see mindfulness intersecting with this right here is self-awareness, adult self-awareness, checking in with our biases, with our practices. What are we doing that's creating or that's continuing systemic oppression and systemic whiteness? What are we doing, and how can we disrupt? So I put the word commitment. I was like, I'm gonna talk about equity, because I feel like, I'm gonna tell you, be honest, in Austin and in my own personal life, equity is something that I've been passionate about for a while, and I like to talk about it. But like a commitment to equity is doing it. So our district, I'm sure several of y'all are familiar with the wheel from Castle. We kind of adapted it and made it our own. And there were several of us on the team that fought tooth and nail to get the word equity included in this wheel. And this was from 2017, and it's taken us until 2020 to start doing the work and to start embodying it. And and we've done beyond diversity training. Dr. Angela Rose Black from Mindfulness for the People is coming to Austin in a couple months, which is really, really exciting. Went with Sally to the Disrupting Systemic Whiteness in the Mindfulness Movement Institute this past summer in Milwaukee with her, and it was incredible. It was the greatest personal learning experience I've ever had. So we're talking about this, and you just like words. For a while, we're like, and at the bottom of the wheel, we have safe, inclusive, culturally responsive, academically engaging, and equitable learning environments. And there would be times when we're talking about this, when people would be like, safe, inclusive, and environments. Just like literally not saying the words. So to like really committing to equity is doing it, is important things like naming it. So that's why I put commitment on there, because I feel like a lot of us might talk about, like, oh yeah, we're committed, we're doing equity, we're passionate about it. And it's like, but what are you doing, and how are you approaching it? How are you living it? And a lot of my growth is responsible to Dr. Angela Ward, who is the Administrative Supervisor for Race and Equity in Austin ISD. Check her out. That's her website. Her website's on this more as well, and her Twitter and Instagram handle. She is amazing and inspiring. And I sent an email, and I asked her. I sent a picture of this slide. I was like, "Hey, Dr. Ward, are you cool with this?" She's like, "Yeah, put and share this stuff and share." This was from an email. I asked. I was like, "Hey, I'm going to be coming to Chicago, and I'm going to be speaking, and I'm going to be on an equity panel. Is there anything that that I can share to best represent cultural proficiency and inclusiveness in Austin ISD?" And just a very simple response: our work is all about identity safety for students and staff in our care. Very simple, incredibly deep and complex. As a cisgender, heterosexual white male, my identity has been safe for centuries. But if you do not identify in those 4 categories, that has not been the case. So creating those spaces for our students and staff. And she was very, very intentional about that. So I've gotten to do work with her. She had a cultural proficiency and inclusiveness cohort. We got to do some action research projects, and that's where I learned about Dr. Angela Rose Black. She also in her work, she had an article in Mindful Magazine. And then this action research project, I was like, how can we get mindfulness to not be used as a tool of punishment or consequence, specifically for students of color in Austin ISD? And I came across the interview, I should put this on there, but the interview between Angela Davis and John Kabat-Zinn when she asked, in a racially unjust world, what good is mindfulness? It was really, really interesting conversation, and she kept pushing John Kabat-Zinn on it, because we have to be super intentional about this, because you can't just breathe racism away. You cannot just breathe racism away. So I owe a ton of credit to Dr. Ward, and she's amazing. One of the things that we have done that she has brought to Austin ISD is the work of Zaretta Hammond. And Zaretta Hammond has been to Austin several times, which is really cool. She wrote Culturally Responsive Teaching in the Brain. And in the book, she has these levels of culture. And this is one slide that I created from about shallow culture from her book. And there we have this whole activity where we talk about surface culture and shallow and deep, and we have people connect and kind of dive in with their own culture and share, and then listen from somebody else from a different background in some type of way, different type of identity. And I've looked at this in all these different types of culture, and in 2017, Austin ISD banned pre-K through second grade suspensions. Because in 2016, well, not because just of this year, but in 2016, there were 343 suspensions of kids, pre-K through second grade. 343. I'm gonna tell you all, that is not just an Austin problem. but I'm keeping it personal, local, and immediate. And 343, 300 of them were students of color. That does not represent the demographics of our students. 300. So I saw this slide, and I don't have the data yet, but I saw this slide, and I said, how many times was a student referred to the principal, suspended, expelled, because of a misunderstanding based on shallow culture, concepts of time, personal space, eye contact? This is also a really good for me, because I committed some harm with regards to these ways of handling emotions, just because, and just like Toby mentioned yesterday in the keynote, the majority of teachers are white women in our country. So we're coming into our classrooms with this one lived experience and then projecting that lived experience onto our students. And guess what? Our students are not all white women. So you can't expect our culture and our lived experience to be our students. So just paying attention to that and understanding that if a student is not making eye contact with you, it's not disrespect. No, don't go straight to you're being defiant. Tempo of work, being honest, all of these things, be curious. Be curious about what's going on. And that's why I go back to self-awareness. That's why I go back to having a personal practice, to being in the moment and catching yourself. Our brains are not wired to not think and to not label. Our brains are wired to label and to look out for safety and look out for what it is that we need in that moment. But it doesn't mean that we're listening to those thoughts all the time and attaching ourselves. Be like, that's a different experience. That's a different outlook. Let me be curious about that. Let me ask some more questions. So, and this is the question when we do the activity that we have people share. How were you taught, or how was it modeled to handle strong emotions? And just the different answers and stuff that arise when we do that. So I mentioned mindfulness rooms, and we can't pretty up our ISS rooms. So this is a mindfulness room that was created in our EDAEP, which is the elementary disciplinary alternative education program, where little kids that get kicked out of school. It's the physical representation of the school to prison pipeline. And this room was 5 years ago, was an isolation room. 5 years ago. They would throw kids in there and lock the door. Elementary kids. And this is not just an Austin thing. This is not just an Austin thing. So one of the first schools that I worked with when I got my job was EDAAP. And we talked about mindfulness, and we learned about the science, and I talked with the staff about practices for soothing their nervous system, because they are carrying a lot for the kiddos who are coming in to their school. So they transformed that isolation room into a mindfulness room, not just for the kids, for the staff, to have a space to go that is nurturing. And obviously, in all situations, you're not going to need the mindfulness room. And in some situations, it's not. Sometimes you need to get out. You need to run. You need to get some energy out, and then you can go. So just that transformation, thinking differently about how we're seeing kids and seeing behaviors.
What do you have on that table?
Oh, I think there's a speaker on there and some different stress. I think there's a glitter jar, some stress balls, different things like that. So I want you at your tables, pick a partner, or have a partner, or maybe you have two partners. Well, with one or two people, I want you to choose one of these prompts. This is from the More Than One Story cards. Have you all ever heard of these? It's this awesome deck of cards, and they're in multiple languages, but they have all these different questions that just ask about like your story. And it's really cool to way to kind of like check in with your story, but then also to hear other stories. So with a partner, let's take a few minutes and choose one of the prompts and just talk with one another, share with one another, okay? I do have an offering. When it's your time, if you're not sharing, I invite you to practice some mindful listening, okay? So you might have, it is totally normal, like I said, our brains aren't wired to just, so you're going to have thoughts. You might be like, oh, man, I'm really thirsty right now. Man, I really gotta go to the bathroom. Also, if you please take bio breaks. But if you have those thoughts, this is what I invite you to do. Something that I like to do is I gently squeeze my toes when I recognize having a thought, and then come back to listening. You might have a thought which is like, and I'm killing this listening thing. Guess what? If you're thinking that, you're not listening. So squeeze those toes and come back to listening, okay? You might have thoughts like, ooh, me too. No, I got a story about that. If you're thinking that and you're focusing on your follow-up question, you're not listening. So just gently squeeze those toes and come back to listen, okay? So we'll take about 3 minutes, so a minute and a half each to share, obviously, again, accept and expect non-closure. Choose one of these prompts and take some time to get to know a partner. Take about 1 more minute, y'all. 1 more minute. Make sure you each get a chance to share.
I do, yeah. I do too. That's how I've been there since 16 years ago. memorizing
This is so hard. I'm gonna give you all so much more time. Thanks, y'all. I realized that I basically planned like a full day presentation. So apologies. Let's take a breath, y'all. Okay, so I'm just going to, like I said, I will give you access to these slides, but I want to give opportunity for y'all to share a little bit at your table and then y'all to ask me some questions. But when I think of trauma awareness, obviously it's important to understand how our students behave, how they react, and especially when talking about mindfulness and practicing mindfulness, to offer choice, so not super rigid, because if we've had kiddos who have experienced trauma or are experiencing trauma, telling them to sit a certain way and to close their eyes can be triggering, just that. So offering different choices in how they sit, allowing like this crossing arms to get some oxytocin, to feel comfortable, to help, give themselves some love. I love this, is my favorite. It's like a little Jedi mind trick. Like when we get hugs, it feels good because of the oxytocin. But when you give yourself a hug, you still get that oxytocin, y'all. You're like tricking your brain, like, haha, I'm just hugging myself right now. So just being aware of that. But this quote, I really love this, being aware of our own triggers. Self-awareness, being aware of our own triggers. And I also love this, the Mandarin character, Ting, to listen. You've got all these different parts in this one character: ears, mind, eyes, undivided attention, heart. That means to listen, y'all. How cool is that? And if we listen to ourselves, we can hear our students. We need to listen to ourselves so that we can hear our students. And that's where mindfulness and education is incredibly powerful. That's where we can start breaking down systems of oppression.
Don't you just.
Okay. I know.
After my white male entire. That's a deep slide. Wow, I've never seen that before.
And we have a Google folder. We'll be sharing all the slides of all the presenters too, and I'll send a link.
Sorry, family.
Yeah. Right. And just another thought of like, there's a cool article, I think it was on Edutopia, about get curious, not furious, different ways to think about. I need to add that article to this more. But just thinking of behaviors and reactions are languages. Those are languages that need to be responded to with compassion. I taught 4 and 5-year-olds, so they like verbally didn't have really the words to express sometimes. But guess what? This is the same with 18-year-olds. It is the same with 18-year-olds. Pay attention to behaviors. Don't take it personally. Pay attention to behaviors. Because those are language. That is our students speaking to us.
Can we do the next 8 minutes of Q&A and then take a break? So we're on, or is there maybe 1 or 2 more slides you want to share?
Yes, I will. Yes. Let me share real quick. So these are a couple different, I will share these, but just giving different breathing exercises to help soothe the nervous system, like doubling your exhale helps soothe it and bring it down. When you do a quick vigorous inhale, that helps pick it up, like, and it feels silly as all get out, but it helps pick up and lift the nervous system. So sharing these different breathing exercises to help students know themselves, they know where they're at, especially if you're familiar with the zones of regulation, using those different colors, and I'll be here all day, we can have more conversation. And then different self-soothing exercises like this. We have all these nerve endings in our hands and in our face. Like that we naturally, like when we're surprised or scared, we go, like that happens. Like, it's like a physiological response. But doing this, taking a nice deep breath in, and then breathing into your hands, feeling the sensation of the breath on your hands, which allows us to focus on that and get us away from that scary thing that's going on in our mind. Or if we've been triggered, we're right here. We're feeling our breath right here. We're not in that traumatic event. And I just love blowing bubbles. So these are questions. I think we're gonna move on to like Q&A. I feel really terrible, but I really want us to think about these, like, and I know we're actually about to have an equity panel, so I can even like talk more about this. But just thinking to yourself, how are we supporting identity safety for students and staff? How are students' behaviors seen and addressed? Thinking about your sphere of influence, how are they seen and addressed? Okay, and then I'm gonna go, shout out to Lizzo, mindfulness offerings. Well, I didn't change it. So these are, I'm gonna keep these up here for questions for us to reflect on, like during lunch if you would like to. But I'm also gonna change this because I had practices, but I wanted to think of offerings, like how are we offering, what are we inviting our students, what are we inviting for our staff? But how, the main question at the end, how are our mindfulness offerings for staff and students honoring community building, student voice, equity commitment, and trauma awareness? All right, so now let's do some Q&A.
Yeah, and is it Free Spirit Publishing that you published
Yes.
your book with?
Yeah.
They did a giveaway. They got us some books, and actually I picked beforehand or drew beforehand so that it would go faster. Table 4-1, and I'm gonna during break I'll get you some free.
Yeah, table 4.
At the end of the day today, James will be selling these, so I'm sure a lot of the graphics you saw they were taking pictures of maybe in here too. He has a newsletter that he does through Austin. You can follow him on Twitter. It's amazing. He'll send links to those newsletters, but you can sign up.
When do you breathe?
Yes.
You can also go to Mindful Classroom. The Bitly has like all the newsletters, and you can sign up and all my contact and stuff like that. So yeah, make sure you write that down.
Okay, does anybody have a question for him in the next 5 minutes, and then we'll take a 10-minute break?
Hi, at our table when we were talking about student voice, a lot of us were feeling kind of stuck at how to even get started with it because it's like we're doing mindfulness but not empowering the students. So do you have any almost like a first step that we can take to do that?
That's a really good question, thank you. The best way that I saw in my experience is having mindfulness leaders, so having students come up and help you with leading the practice. Kids are brilliant, y'all. They they feel it, they see it, they get into it, and then I also found that my students that were having the hardest time with it, the ones that weren't really bought in, when I had them come up and help me, game changer. Because behaviors, seeing behaviors, seeing that behavior of making a whole bunch of noise and be like, no, I'm not doing this, I'm not doing this. They're trying to be heard. Give them a chance to be heard. So, mindfulness leaders is a really, really, really cool way. And then getting their feedback on what they might want to do, what activities they might want to do. Maybe they come up with their own, sticker pose. My Twitter is, it's on there, but Mr. Butler 629, MRBUTLER 629. And also, yes.
James, how the challenge is, how do we, as people who are on board with this, here we are, two white males, it's a very white room. That's not a bad thing, it is what it is. And it's powerful because we're here talking about how we want to dismantle this. If this thing is ever going to happen in this country, there's going to have to be a hell of a lot more white people sitting in rooms actually listening and learning and talking and expressing and learning. You know, Pete Seeger used to say it's easy to talk to the people who agree with you. It's hard to talk to the people who disagree with you. And that goes for ideas and subjects and challenges. But how do you relate to your white audiences when the message that you're bringing is we've got to wake up from our dream of whiteness and start becoming human beings on this planet with other human beings? How do you address that?
In Texas.
In Texas, of all places.
And if you want to think about that for 10 minutes, we can start the equity camp with it. But that's a good one.
Well, I mean, my very brief answer is sharing my personal story, sharing where I've come with regards to my own racial awareness and growth, and that I'm still growing, making it, I don't want, by no means, don't call me woke, because I'm not. I'm learning and I'm growing, and sharing mistakes that I have made. One of the activities at the Disrupting Mindfulness, or Disrupting Systemic Whiteness in the mindfulness movement was, and it was all white people in the audience, led by black women. And one of the activities we had to do is we had to sit down with a partner that we did or did not know and share how we have caused harm to people of color, and to name that. And I'll never forget Dr. Liston, who was leading that. She said, if we want racism to end, these are the stories you need to tell your grandkids. So sharing those stories, obviously, making sure that it's a white affinity group, because I'm not trying to share how I've harmed people of color with people of color. Y'all already know. And I'm not trying to re-traumatize. So sharing, just being very vulnerable and authentic.
Thank you. We're going to take a 10-minute break at 10.